At 12:01 p.m., Wall Street bustled as usual. Lunch hour, deliveries, a wagon at the curb. No one thought twice. Then the wagon exploded. 38 dead, hundreds injured, and the bomber disappeared. No suspect, no closure. Just flyers hinting at revenge. This story isn't about the explosion. It's about how normalcy blinds us, and how the deadliest attacks go unnoticed. By the morning of September 16, 1920, Lower Manhattan's financial district operated under the assumption that political violence was a distant threat. Labor strikes and radical pamphlets had stirred unrest after World War I. But Wall Street remained calm, its operations governed by routine. The district's stone buildings and institutions like the United States Assay Office and J.P. Morgan & Co. symbolized stability and American financial strength. That day was typical. The weather was clear, and the streets were crowded with workers, messengers, and vendors during the lunch hour. A horse-drawn wagon moved through the area, blending with the midday traffic. It stopped in front of the United States Assay Office across from the J.P. Morgan building. The driver dismounted and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. At 12:01 p.m., the wagon exploded. The blast was immediate and violent. Hidden dynamite ignited, tearing apart the vehicle and killing the horse. Hundreds of pounds of cast iron sash weights were propelled outward, ripping through bodies and buildings. Those closest to the blast died instantly, while others were struck by flying debris. The shockwave shattered windows, and offices were filled with smoke and debris. Within hours, at least 38 people were dead, and nearly 300 were injured. Most of the victims were clerks, stenographers, and messengers. Ordinary people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The surrounding buildings suffered extensive damage, and the financial cost was estimated at $2 million. However, the real impact was psychological. The heart of American finance had been attacked. The explosion was quickly determined to be deliberate. The placement of the wagon and the absence of the driver confirmed it as an act of terrorism. The New York Police Department, along with federal agencies like the Secret Service and the Bureau of Investigation, quickly took charge of the scene. By the next morning, the cleanup had begun. Debris was cleared, and broken glass was swept away. Wall Street reopened for business with remarkable speed, but the critical physical evidence had been erased. Shrapnel and remnants of the bomb were discarded as refuse, preventing investigators from tracing key clues. Despite conflicting witness accounts, the investigation began. Descriptions of the driver were vague, and the materials used in the bomb, dynamite and cast iron weights, were common at the time, making them difficult to trace. A potential lead emerged when a postal worker found leaflets near the blast site, written in crude political rhetoric and signed by an anarchist group. Investigators tried to trace the origin of the flyers, but no conclusive links were found. Suspicion turned to Italian anarchists, particularly followers of Luigi Galliani, a radical figure linked to previous bombings. Despite efforts to find connections, no individual could be conclusively tied to the bombing. By 1923, the investigation stalled, and the case was quietly abandoned. The Wall Street bombing, one of the deadliest acts of terrorism before World War II, remained unsolved. Its impact endured, leading to the expansion of federal investigative powers, increased surveillance of radical political groups, and growing public fear during the Red Scare. Though Wall Street resumed its operations, the scars left by the bombing remained, both in the buildings and in the unanswered question of who was responsible. By 1920, the United States had entered a period of increasing internal strain. While the end of World War I had expanded industrial capacity and elevated global influence, it also revealed cracks in the social fabric. Millions of returning soldiers found themselves in an economy unable to absorb them, while inflation surged and wages lagged behind prices. Labor strikes, escalated by growing discontent, became widespread across key sectors. The sense of unity forged during the war dissolved into division, suspicion, and political fragmentation. In urban centers like New York City, these pressures were felt acutely. The city's population, already diverse and dense, was further strained by an influx of workers, immigrants, and radical political movements. Strikes in transportation, manufacturing, and shipping created disruptions, while police responses to demonstrations only deepened tensions. Radical political movements, including socialist and anarchist organizations, became more visible, and their rhetoric, advocating the dismantling of the political and economic systems, spurred a polarized public debate. Violent acts, including bombings, began to punctuate this discourse, blurring the lines between dissent and extremism. The year 1919 had seen a series of bombings targeting prominent figures in the political and business sectors. These attacks, though limited in casualties, highlighted significant vulnerabilities in national security. Federal authorities, alarmed by the coordination and ideological motivation behind the bombings, expanded their efforts to track and neutralize radical groups. The Bureau of Investigation, still in its early stages, ramped up surveillance and enforcement, leading to raids, arrests, and deportations. These actions, while framed as necessary for national security, raised concerns about the erosion of civil liberties. The response was divided. Some Americans supported the crackdown, viewing radical movements as a threat to national values. Others, however, criticized the broad scope of the measures, fearing that repression would only fuel further resentment and radicalization. The country found itself at a crossroads, uncertain how to balance security and freedom in the face of rising political extremism. Despite these tensions, Wall Street, the financial heart of the nation, remained largely unaffected. It was a symbol of American financial power and international influence, and its daily operations continued to be governed by routine rather than fear. Security measures were minimal, and the financial district's open streets and buildings suggested a false sense of invulnerability. The concentration of power and capital seemed to insulate it from the turbulence surrounding the country. Despite growing national unrest, the financial district operated with little concern for the radical movements gaining ground elsewhere. Wall Street's leadership, accustomed to managing financial risk, did not fully grasp the implications of the rising political violence. The idea that Wall Street could become a direct target was not part of their worldview. Security, if considered at all, was viewed in terms of financial risks rather than physical threats. The Italian anarchist movement, particularly the followers of Luigi Galliani, played a key role in this context. Galliani's followers rejected gradual reforms, advocating instead for the complete dismantling of the political and economic systems. Many were immigrants, who had arrived seeking better opportunities, but faced harsh working conditions and discrimination. Galliani's decentralized network made it difficult for law enforcement to infiltrate or dismantle. Although Galliani had been deported in 1919, his followers remained active and undeterred by his absence. The Red Scare, ignited by the Russian Revolution, intensified fears of foreign influence, merging concerns over labor unrest and political radicalism. Radical groups were increasingly associated with subversion, prompting widespread surveillance and enforcement. Media coverage, emphasizing the threat of violence, contributed to a national sense of insecurity. The line between free speech and violence blurred, and public fear of radical action grew. While these tensions were shaping national politics, the financial district remained relatively insulated. Executives and financiers were aware of previous bombings, but viewed them as isolated incidents targeting individuals rather than public spaces. They saw a clear distinction between targeted violence against individuals and indiscriminate violence against crowds. This assumption, however, proved flawed. The lack of systematic security checks allowed for vulnerabilities to be exploited, especially as the political climate made ordinary objects and vehicles potential weapons. By the summer of 1920, radical movements had adopted a more cautious approach, but law enforcement struggled to keep pace. The absence of major incidents in the preceding year led some to believe that enforcement actions had succeeded, but others saw it as a temporary lull before further attacks. Federal authorities remained on edge, but their capacity to prevent attacks was still limited. Intelligence gathering was underdeveloped, and the investigative methods of the time were primitive. As the financial district continued its daily routines, unaware of the growing threat, the stage was set for a major disruption. The attack that would soon occur would not only cause physical damage, but also force a reevaluation of national security. It would highlight the vulnerabilities of public spaces and demonstrate that radical violence could strike at the heart of American power, with far-reaching consequences. In 1920, horse-drawn wagons were a common sight in New York City, particularly in commercial districts like Wall Street. They carried goods such as produce, coal, and office supplies, and their presence was unremarkable. These wagons blended seamlessly into the daily rhythm of city life. The wagon used in the Wall Street bombing adhered to this norm, appearing no different from any other delivery vehicle. Its horse, dimensions, and design were typical of the vehicles used for commercial deliveries, allowing it to pass unnoticed in one of the busiest financial districts in the nation. Inside the wagon, however, was something far from ordinary: a carefully assembled device. The explosive charge consisted of approximately 100 pounds of dynamite, surrounded by 500 pounds of cast iron sash weights, which were typically used in window construction. The iron weights were intentionally chosen to maximize casualties by becoming high-speed shrapnel upon detonation. The arrangement of materials revealed careful planning. The dynamite was positioned strategically to ensure that the iron weights would be propelled outward with deadly force. The wagon's wooden structure acted as a container designed to disintegrate upon detonation, amplifying the blast's impact. The device was likely triggered by a timed mechanism, and not by manual detonation, allowing the perpetrator to escape before the explosion. Timing was crucial. The device was set to detonate during Wall Street's lunch hour, when foot traffic was at its peak. The intersection of Wall Street and Broad Street, one of the busiest intersections in the area, was chosen strategically to ensure maximum exposure. The wagon was placed directly in front of the United States Assay Office, across from the J.P. Morgan building, ensuring that both buildings and the people between them would suffer significant damage. After placing the bomb, the driver calmly dismounted from the wagon and walked away, blending effortlessly into the crowd. There was no rush, no attempt to conceal his departure. The wagon, left unattended, became part of the city's routine. Pedestrians passed by without suspicion, as unattended wagons were a common feature in the district. The driver's actions were deliberate, designed to exploit the trust people had in their everyday surroundings. At 12:01 p.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. The wagon was instantly destroyed, and the horse was killed. The confined streets amplified the effect of the blast, sending iron shrapnel flying in all directions. Pedestrians, office workers, and messengers were struck indiscriminately. Those closest to the blast were killed instantly, while others were severely wounded. The shockwave shattered windows, and the force of the explosion caused buildings to shake. Inside nearby offices, desks and furniture were overturned, and papers filled the air, creating chaos in the aftermath. The force of the explosion caused widespread devastation, but investigators faced immense difficulty in piecing together the bomb's construction. Iron fragments from the sash weights were found embedded in buildings and walls, while others were scattered several blocks away. However, the materials used in the bomb, dynamite and cast iron weights, were commonplace. These materials could not be traced to a specific source, as they were widely available for industrial and construction purposes. The delivery method, using a horse-drawn wagon, was unremarkable and allowed the bomb to blend seamlessly into the surroundings. Wagons were less scrutinized than motor vehicles and were part of the everyday life in the district. This simplicity in design and delivery made the attack difficult to trace, and the anonymity of the driver compounded the difficulty. No one could recall distinct details about his appearance. The lack of physical evidence and reliable witness accounts left law enforcement with few concrete leads. The method of delivery underscored a shift in domestic terrorism. While earlier attacks had targeted specific individuals, the Wall Street bombing marked a departure. This was an attack on a public space, aimed at inflicting mass casualties. The simplicity of the bomb and its delivery method revealed vulnerabilities in urban security as it exploited the predictability of city life. Routine activities, like the delivery of goods, could mask violent intent, making traditional security measures ineffective. The bombing was not about targeting specific individuals, it was about maximizing casualties among ordinary workers. The anonymity of the driver ensured that the perpetrator could escape without leaving a trace. The attack was executed in a way that minimized the risk for the perpetrator while maximizing destruction and fear. The investigation struggled from the outset. The destruction of the crime scene, combined with the anonymity of the driver, made it difficult to trace the attack back to any specific individual or group. The simplicity of the bomb and its delivery method exposed vulnerabilities in security practices, but it also revealed the limits of early 20th century investigative methods. The bombing marked a shift in domestic terrorism, one that would force a reconsideration of how security threats were conceptualized. and how law enforcement could address them in a modern city. The explosion at 12:01 p.m. on Wall Street was not just a singular event, but a rapid series of devastating effects. As the dynamite ignited, a violent pressure wave expanded outward from the center of the wagon. The wooden structure shattered instantly, sending fragments flying in all directions. The iron sash weights, packed around the dynamite, were propelled outward at incredible speed, turning into deadly projectiles. The confined space of the street amplified the blast's impact, causing the shrapnel to tear through buildings and bodies alike. For those closest to the blast, the results were immediate and lethal. The force of the explosion created overpressure, a crushing wave of energy that caused internal injuries. Lungs collapsed, organs ruptured, and bones shattered under compressive stress. Death was instantaneous for many, the blast taking life before awareness or fear could even register. The horse, too, was killed instantly, its body adding to the destruction that lay in the wake of the explosion. As the pressure wave expanded, it encountered the stone facades of buildings, amplifying its force. The impact was so powerful that windows across multiple blocks shattered in unison. Glass fragments added to the already lethal environment, becoming additional cutting surfaces as they joined the shrapnel cloud. The blast tore through the street, leaving behind devastation. The iron sash weights did their job with brutal efficiency. They cut through clothing, flesh, and bone, some embedding deep into the walls of nearby buildings. The randomness of their trajectory meant that injuries were widespread. People caught by these projectiles were struck with terrifying accuracy, their wounds often deep and life-threatening. The blast radius extended far beyond Wall Street, reaching adjacent streets and buildings, creating an unprecedented scene of destruction. The sound of the explosion was described as a singular, concussive roar, amplified by the narrow streets and tall buildings of Lower Manhattan. The blast reverberated through the district, shaking the ground and echoing for blocks. To those farther away, the sound was so intense that it was initially mistaken for an earthquake or industrial accident. The lack of visible fire or smoke in distant areas confused witnesses, adding to the chaos of the moment. Within seconds, the street was blanketed in dust and smoke, the air thick with pulverized stone, wood, and debris. Visibility plummeted, making it difficult for survivors to orient themselves. The immediate aftermath was marked by complete disarray. Pedestrians and office workers, some of them still conscious, staggered through the smoke-filled streets, many severely wounded. Some tried to flee, but their efforts were often short-lived, with many collapsing from their injuries. The area was a scene of chaos. Bodies lay scattered across the pavement, some motionless, others still exhibiting signs of life but quickly fading. As emergency responders arrived, they were faced with the overwhelming task of assessing the damage. Ambulances, firefighters, and police officers worked to secure the area, but the sheer number of casualties stretched their resources to the limit. Volunteers rushed to assist, but the chaos only increased as more injured individuals were brought to the makeshift treatment centers. Hospitals across Manhattan filled rapidly with victims, many suffering from severe shrapnel wounds, burns, and blunt force trauma. The types of injuries varied greatly, with many victims requiring immediate, life-saving treatment under extreme pressure. Medical supplies were quickly depleted as the number of injured continued to rise. By the end of the day, at least 38 people were confirmed dead. The death toll would rise in the coming hours as some victims succumbed to internal injuries or blood loss. Nearly 300 others were wounded, with many of them facing life-altering injuries. The victims were, for the most part, not high-profile individuals. Many were clerks, stenographers, messengers, and pedestrians who happened to be in the area at the wrong time. The attack was indiscriminate, targeting ordinary people rather than specific figures of power or influence. The physical damage to Wall Street was also severe. Shrapnel scars were visible across the facades of nearby buildings, and windows were shattered in several blocks. Personal belongings, papers, bags, and other items were scattered across the street, some of them irreparably damaged by the force of the explosion. The total cost of property damage was estimated at $2 million, a significant sum for the time. Yet, as damaging as this was, it paled in comparison to the human cost of the bombing. Within hours, efforts to clean up the area began. The streets were swept clear of debris, bloodstains were scrubbed from the pavement, and broken glass was cleared from storefronts. These efforts, aimed at returning the district to normalcy, were undertaken with urgency, as financial institutions and government offices understood that any prolonged disruption could undermine confidence in the economy. Despite the visible restoration, however, the critical evidence had been destroyed or discarded in the process. The shrapnel that could have provided key clues was swept away as refuse, and the blast site was altered beyond recognition. The decision to prioritize reopening Wall Street quickly, while practical, had significant consequences for the investigation. Law enforcement, arriving after the cleanup, found little to work with. The absence of preserved physical evidence, such as intact shrapnel fragments or clear blast patterns, made it impossible to reconstruct the bomb. Investigators were left to rely on witness accounts and limited material recovered from the scene. But without concrete evidence, the investigation faltered. The bombing presented new challenges for law enforcement. It demonstrated how simple, everyday materials could be weaponized to devastating effect, and how difficult it could be to trace an attack back to a specific individual or group. The use of a horse-drawn wagon to deliver the bomb was a tactic that allowed the perpetrator to remain anonymous. Witness descriptions of the driver were inconsistent, with few details emerging to identify the attacker. The anonymity afforded by the crowded streets ensured that the perpetrator's escape was facilitated. The shift in the nature of domestic terrorism, demonstrated by the Wall Street bombing, was stark. Previously, attacks had targeted specific individuals, often with personal motives. The bombing, however, was a calculated attempt to inflict as much harm as possible on a public space. This change in tactics posed new challenges for law enforcement and security personnel. It expanded the scope of potential targets and complicated efforts to prevent future attacks. In the aftermath of the bombing, the attack raised critical questions about how to protect public spaces from such acts of violence. The simplicity of the bomb and the methods used to deliver it exposed vulnerabilities in the city's infrastructure and in the existing security practices. The attack on Wall Street highlighted the limitations of traditional security measures, making it clear that protection needed to extend beyond private buildings and government offices to include public spaces where people congregated. The aftermath of the Wall Street bombing created a stark and immediate division between the dead and the living. For those closest to the blast, death was instantaneous. High-velocity shrapnel tore through vital organs and limbs, with some victims dismembered or so severely injured that their identification relied solely on fragments of clothing or personal belongings. Death came swiftly, leaving no time for fear or even awareness, cutting through the rhythms of daily life in a single moment. Farther from the epicenter, survival was dictated by mere inches and seconds. Some victims were struck by shrapnel, while others found themselves shielded by the bodies of those closer to the explosion. The randomness of survival was apparent, with individuals standing side by side, experiencing vastly different fates. Shock dulled the pain for some, allowing them to move despite severe injuries, while others were immobilized by internal bleeding or head trauma, injuries that would prove fatal in the hours that followed. The street, once bustling with life, became a chaotic scene where survival often depended on the luck of finding immediate medical attention. The injuries were horrific. Shrapnel wounds dominated, with iron fragments embedding deep into muscle and bone. The sheer severity of the injuries increased the risk of infection, and many victims required immediate surgical intervention. Burns were less common, but did occur in those closer to the explosion. The explosion also caused blunt force trauma for those thrown against walls, furniture, or the ground. Office workers inside nearby buildings were struck by flying glass and debris, with some thrown across rooms from the force of the blast. The lines between interior and exterior spaces collapsed, causing further injuries inside buildings. The distinction between life and death in the immediate aftermath was fluid. Many survivors appeared unharmed initially, but would later succumb to internal injuries. Some victims who had been seriously injured at the scene were quickly treated and recovered, but for others, the road to recovery was long and uncertain. Identifying the dead was a slow and complicated process, as many victims were so severely disfigured that traditional methods of identification, such as photographs or personal effects, were not enough. Families seeking answers faced a painful uncertainty, with information often delayed or unavailable. The emotional toll on survivors was felt immediately. While modern psychological terms like PTSD were not used at the time, many experienced lasting trauma. Confusion, nightmares, and persistent fear became part of their lives. Some survivors returned to work, while others found it impossible to do so, their daily routines shattered by the violence they had witnessed. Medical facilities struggled to keep up with the overwhelming number of victims. Emergency rooms were filled to capacity, and doctors worked under extreme pressure, improvising when supplies ran low. Amputations and emergency surgeries became necessary for some survivors, leaving them with permanent disabilities. The dead, meanwhile, were memorialized through brief notices in newspapers. Lists of names, often followed by simple descriptions of their jobs, were the only public recognition of their deaths. These individuals, mostly clerks, stenographers, messengers, and ordinary workers, were not public figures, and their deaths were mourned deeply by their families, but lacked the symbolic weight that high-profile figures might have received. Funerals took place, ranging from small, intimate gatherings to larger ceremonies, reflecting the community's grief. However, the absence of an identified perpetrator complicated the mourning process, as families and survivors were left with no closure or sense of justice. The financial district, despite the tragic loss of life, resumed operations quickly. Newspapers framed the resumption of business as a sign of resilience, a return to normalcy after an unprecedented attack. Yet beneath the surface, fear and unease lingered. People were now more alert to unattended vehicles, suspicious activity, and any signs of potential danger. The scars of the bombing, visible on building facades, served as constant reminders of the vulnerability of the space. Despite the outward appearance of normalcy, the knowledge that death had arrived without warning remained present in the collective consciousness of those who worked in the area. The Wall Street bombing revealed the vulnerability of public spaces in a way that had not been fully acknowledged before. The attack did not target specific individuals. It aimed to inflict mass casualties on the unsuspecting public. The randomness of the violence complicated the law enforcement response, as the event could not be understood through the traditional frameworks of political violence, which typically targeted individuals. The bombing forced a reassessment of security priorities and brought to the forefront the challenges of preventing violence rooted in ideology within an open society. In the days and weeks following the bombing, the investigation faced insurmountable challenges. The destruction of evidence, coupled with the anonymity of the perpetrator, made it difficult to gather any concrete clues. While the blast demonstrated the deadly potential of simple, everyday materials, it also exposed the limitations of the investigative methods at the time. The bombing's significance stretched far beyond the immediate destruction. It reshaped the way domestic terrorism was viewed and highlighted the vulnerabilities of urban life that would require long-term solutions. For the survivors and their families, the bombing's impact was lasting. It left an indelible mark on the community, affecting how people viewed their safety and security. It was not just the method of the attack or its symbolism that defined the event. It was the human cost. The lives interrupted by shrapnel, the families left behind, and the survivors forced to live with permanent disabilities were the true legacy of the bombing. The dead and the living shared this experience, bound together by the violence that, while unresolved, would continue to reverberate for years to come. The hours immediately following the Wall Street bombing were defined by one overarching goal: restoration. Wall Street was not only a crime scene, it was the financial heart of the nation. Its disruption had the potential to send shockwaves throughout the economy. Financial institutions, government offices, and city officials understood that any prolonged closure of the area could undermine public confidence, affecting not just the financial markets, but the city's stability as a whole. Therefore, the pressure to act quickly was immense. Once the wounded had been removed and the dead accounted for, the primary concern shifted to clearing the street. Debris, glass, and remnants of the wagon and horse littered the area. Personal belongings, office materials, and fragments of buildings were strewn across the street. The visible signs of destruction were overwhelming, but the urgency of returning the district to functionality took precedence. Municipal cleanup crews worked rapidly, clearing debris, removing street fixtures, and repairing temporary damage to buildings. By midnight, much of the visible damage had been addressed. Streets were swept, street signs were cleared, and a semblance of normalcy was restored. The speed of cleanup was driven by multiple factors. Wall Street's reopening was viewed not only as a demonstration of resilience, but also as an economic necessity. Businesses needed to resume operations, and financial institutions could not afford to be seen as vulnerable. The city's officials emphasized the importance of rapid recovery, framing it as a sign of strength. They wanted to show that the bombing would not cripple Wall Street, nor would it disrupt the broader economy for long. It was a narrative of triumph over terror, pushing the message that the city could recover quickly and continue its vital operations. However, this swift restoration came at a significant cost. Evidence that could have helped identify the bomb's builder was discarded. Shrapnel fragments embedded in walls were pried out, pieces of the wagon were collected and discarded, and bloodstains were scrubbed away from the pavement. The decision to quickly restore normalcy meant that investigators lost valuable physical evidence. Modern forensic techniques, like the preservation of explosive residue or bomb fragments, were not in place at the time. The act of cleaning the site, though crucial for Wall Street's operational recovery, also made it nearly impossible for authorities to trace the bomb's origin. By the morning of September 17, Wall Street had reopened. Office workers began returning to their desks, and the day's financial transactions resumed. Yet, the streets still bore visible scars. Windows were boarded up, scaffolding appeared in various places, and marks on building facades from the shrapnel remained visible. While these efforts restored the functional aspects of the district, they could not erase the emotional weight of what had happened. The presence of police officers provided reassurance, but their role was mostly symbolic at this point. The thoroughness of the cleanup painted an image of a district returned to business as usual. But beneath the surface, deeper concerns about security and the bombing's broader implications simmered. The rapid reopening was widely publicized, and newspapers lauded it as a symbol of resilience. Editorials praised the city's ability to restore order so quickly, aligning the recovery with broader narratives of national strength and economic continuity. However, this narrative of resilience, while important for public morale, obscured deeper issues about security and accountability. The attack had exposed significant vulnerabilities in the area, and reopening without addressing these concerns raised long-term questions. Was Wall Street truly safe? Or was this merely an illusion of normalcy? Law enforcement's response was immediately impacted by the cleanup. Investigators who arrived after the scene had been cleared found little in the way of physical evidence. The absence of intact shrapnel fragments or clear blast patterns made it incredibly difficult to reconstruct the bomb. The cleanup had essentially swept away much of what could have helped connect the attack to a specific person or group. This decision, driven by the need for swift recovery, meant that the investigation was left hampered by what was lost in the process. The rebuilding of Wall Street proceeded alongside these investigative efforts. Stone facades were patched, windows replaced, and offices restored. The district was gradually returned to its regular function. Life on Wall Street, it seemed, moved forward. But the contrast between this rapid physical recovery and the unresolved nature of the investigation became a defining feature of the post-bombing environment. The scars left on the Morgan Building's facade were visible reminders of the attack. They could not be erased as easily as the rest of the district's damage. Some saw these marks as evidence of the vulnerability of public spaces, a permanent reminder of the violence that had occurred. Others saw them as symbols of endurance, proof that Wall Street had withstood the attack and continued to function. Over time, these marks became a part of the collective memory of the district. The decision to reopen quickly raised public questions about law enforcement's efficacy. The lack of visible disruption suggested that the city had regained control, but it also concealed the uncertainty that still remained. Questions about the effectiveness of the investigation grew louder. As the days passed without any arrests, the contrast between Wall Street's return to normalcy and the unresolved case became more pronounced. The narrative of resilience was strong, but it did not extend to resolution. The perpetrators remained unidentified, and the question of who had carried out the attack hung in the air. Within government circles, the cleanup became a point of internal reflection. Some officials acknowledged that the destruction of evidence had hindered the investigation, while others defended the decision, arguing that restoring normalcy was necessary for the city's psychological and economic recovery. This debate underscored the tension between the immediate practical needs of the city and the long-term security concerns that remained unaddressed. The rebuilding of Wall Street went beyond physical repairs. It involved reasserting the norms and expectations of daily life. Office workers adjusted their routines, avoided certain areas, and altered their schedules. These changes were informal, reflecting personal responses rather than coordinated citywide policies. Security measures, though discussed, remained minimal by modern standards. There were no permanent checkpoints or vehicle inspections. The openness of the district remained largely intact. The rapid transformation of Wall Street from a site of mass violence to a functional district underscored the city's ability to adapt quickly. It revealed a willingness to absorb loss and trauma without fully reckoning with the deeper implications of the attack. The dead were mourned privately, and the wounded adapted to their injuries. But the street moved on. The attack had exposed the vulnerability of public spaces. But the restoration of Wall Street suggested a desire to return to business as usual, without addressing the fundamental security risks that had been exposed. The investigation into the Wall Street bombing began amidst an atmosphere of urgency and uncertainty. The scale of the attack demanded an immediate response, but the systems for coordinating such a broad investigation were still in their infancy. Multiple agencies, primarily the New York Police Department, the U.S. Secret Service, and the Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the FBI, asserted jurisdiction over the case. However, the absence of a preserved crime scene significantly complicated the investigation from the outset. The NIPT took immediate responsibility for gathering witness statements. Officers questioned clerks, messengers, office workers, and bystanders. But the fragmented nature of the testimonies offered little clarity. Witness descriptions of the wagon driver were inconsistent. Some remembered a man of average height wearing dark clothing, while others could not recall his appearance at all. No reliable or consistent profile emerged from these accounts. The anonymity afforded by the crowded streets, especially during lunch hour, made it even more difficult to piece together a clear description of the driver. The fire department assisted in technical assessments of the blast, confirming that the explosion had been deliberately designed to maximize casualties. The dynamite used, along with the cast iron sash weights, indicated an intent to inflict harm, not simply destroy property. This further solidified the conclusion that the bombing was an act of terrorism, aimed at the heart of American finance. Despite these early findings, progress was slow, and the lack of solid leads made the investigation a frustrating and daunting task. Federal involvement soon expanded. The U.S. Secret Service, responsible for protecting federal institutions, focused its efforts on investigating any potential threats to the government's financial systems. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Investigation, under its limited mandate, concentrated on interstate crimes and politically motivated attacks. The coordination between these agencies, however, was hampered by a lack of standardized protocols, communication barriers, and a shortage of manpower. This fragmentation of authority slowed down progress and meant that critical connections were often overlooked. The investigation's efforts to reconstruct the bomb from the remnants found at the scene proved particularly difficult. The cast iron sash weights used in the device were common materials and were widely available for construction purposes. The dynamite itself was similarly ubiquitous, making it nearly impossible to trace its origin. Even the wagon used for delivery posed a challenge to investigators. Wagons, often privately owned or borrowed, were difficult to track, with no formal records linking them to the bombing. The rapid cleanup of the scene, though necessary to restore normalcy in the city's financial district, further hindered the investigation. Physical evidence was quickly discarded. Shrapnel fragments embedded in walls were removed, pieces of the wagon were collected and thrown away, and bloodstains were scrubbed off the streets. This hasty cleanup reflected the priority placed on restoring the district to its usual operations, especially considering Wall Street's role as the economic heart of the nation. However, it meant that crucial forensic evidence, which could have potentially provided valuable clues, was lost. In hindsight, this decision to restore normalcy quickly at the expense of preserving the crime scene would be one of the greatest impediments to solving the case. By the morning of September 17, Wall Street had reopened. Office workers returned to their desks, and business resumed as usual. However, the physical scars of the bombing remained visible. Windows were boarded up, scaffolding appeared on some buildings, and the marks left by the blast were still visible on the facades of nearby buildings. The presence of police officers offered a sense of reassurance to the public, but their role was largely symbolic. Law enforcement's response, despite being publicized as swift and efficient, was also hampered by the destruction of the crime scene. Without the physical evidence that might have led to a break in the case, investigators were left to rely on witness testimony and other intangible sources of information. The investigation was further complicated by the lack of modern forensic tools. Fingerprint analysis, a technology still in its infancy at the time, was largely ineffective in the context of a bombing, where surfaces had been obliterated by the force of the explosion. There was no way to analyze explosive residue for clues or trace the origins of the materials used in the bomb. Even more advanced investigative techniques that we now take for granted, such as DNA analysis or ballistic testing, were not available, leaving law enforcement to rely on methods that would seem rudimentary by today's standards. Despite these setbacks, law enforcement continued its investigation. Witnesses were interviewed again, and follow-up interviews were conducted. The fragmented nature of witness testimony and the absence of definitive evidence made this a difficult, often fruitless process. While the physical evidence had been lost or discarded, authorities turned to political motivations, looking for links between the bombing and radical movements. They focused on possible connections to anarchist groups, particularly those active in Italy, as well as other political extremists who might have had an interest in attacking Wall Street. The federal agencies, especially the Bureau of Investigation, began to shift the focus of their inquiries toward individuals with political motives. Anarchist groups had been linked to previous bombings, including those in 1919, and many anarchists had expressed hostility toward financial institutions and the political elite. The idea that the bombing was ideologically motivated seemed plausible, especially given the crude political leaflets that were discovered in the days following the explosion. The language used in these leaflets, angry, threatening, and referencing political prisoners, mirrored the rhetoric of Italian anarchists, particularly those influenced by Luigi Galleani. However, the absence of concrete evidence meant that investigators could only speculate. The decentralized nature of anarchist movements, particularly those tied to Galleani's followers, made it difficult to pinpoint specific individuals. The lack of a clear suspect left law enforcement grappling with the possibility that the bombing was part of a larger ideological struggle, rather than the work of a lone actor. This uncertainty contributed to the frustration that permeated the investigation, with law enforcement agencies struggling to determine the best course of action. In the days following the bombing, a discovery provided investigators with a potential lead. A postal worker, while clearing debris near the site of the explosion, found several leaflets scattered on the ground. The leaflets, printed on low-quality paper with uneven ink and noticeable spelling errors, appeared crude and hastily produced. Their tone was blunt and threatening, referencing political prisoners and promising more violence unless specific demands were met. They were signed by a group calling itself American Anarchist Fighters, a name that did not correspond to any known organization, but its radical language echoed previous anarchist rhetoric. The leaflets quickly became a focal point of the investigation. Their message was strikingly similar to other anarchist communications from the previous year. The references to political prisoners and the call for direct action aligned with the ideological stance of Italian anarchists, particularly those connected to the radical figure Luigi Galleani. Although the leaflets did not directly claim responsibility for the bombing, their timing suggested that they were meant to reinforce the ideological message of the attack and provoke fear in the public. Investigators began an immediate search for the origin of the flyers. They visited print shops across New York City, hoping to trace the production of the leaflets. However, the decentralized nature of the small printing operations made it nearly impossible to find any conclusive leads. Most print shops had no formal records, and transactions were often made in cash. It was common for short runs of flyers to be produced anonymously, making it easy for radical groups to disseminate material without leaving a trace. Investigators expanded their search outside the city, but no definitive connections were made, and the leaflets remained a mysterious piece of the puzzle. The content of the flyers raised several questions. They made no specific reference to the Wall Street bombing itself, leaving their purpose open to interpretation. Was this an attempt to claim responsibility? A call for further action? Or merely a strategy to heighten public fear? Some investigators speculated that the leaflets might have been placed as a misdirection, but the tone, content, and style seemed too consistent with anarchist tactics to dismiss as such. The name American Anarchist Fighters raised additional scrutiny. It was a generic label, typical of anarchist groups that avoided formal membership and hierarchical structure. This made it difficult for investigators to trace the group's origin or identify its members. The language of the flyers emphasized collective action and a rejection of centralized authority, consistent with anarchist practices of the time. but offered little to connect them to a specific individual or group. The discovery of the leaflets generated media coverage, fueling public fear and suspicion. Newspapers reported their findings, presenting them as evidence of a larger, ongoing anarchist campaign. This media coverage contributed to an increased sense of insecurity among the public. Calls for stronger actions against radical political groups grew louder, and law enforcement's focus shifted toward monitoring anarchist communities more closely. While the leaflets added a sense of urgency to the investigation, they did little to advance concrete leads. The investigation began to focus on anarchist networks, increasing surveillance, and questioning known activists. However, as time passed, the impact of the leaflets began to fade. The significance of the flyers diminished as no new clues emerged. Despite the aggressive pursuit of leads, there was no direct evidence linking the leaflets to a specific individual or group. Their role in the investigation, though pivotal for a brief moment, became more symbolic, representing the larger ideological context in which the bombing had occurred, rather than providing tangible clues to the perpetrator's identity. The leaflets, though never definitively connected to the bombing, ensured that the event would be remembered as politically charged. The investigation, shaped by their presence, continued to reflect the challenges of confronting decentralized violence rooted in ideology. The legacy of the flyers, and their connection to broader anarchist movements, would influence the way the bombing was remembered. The case shifted from being a crime with an identifiable perpetrator to an event embedded within a larger ideological conflict. It served as a reminder of how acts of violence, even when unexplained, can shape public perception and fuel fears of a broader political struggle. In the days following the bombing, the investigation's focus began to shift from identifying a specific individual to targeting a broader category: anarchism. Authorities, already concerned about the rise of radical political movements, saw this attack as further proof that anarchism was a growing domestic threat. The bombing fit a pattern that had already begun to alarm law enforcement, prompting a shift from tracking down a singular perpetrator to focusing on the larger ideological movement. Anarchism, as it existed in early 20th century America, was not a unified movement, but rather a decentralized collection of individuals and groups opposed to capitalism, state authority, and coercive institutions. Some adherents of anarchism believed that the only legitimate response to systemic oppression was violent action, while others focused on speech, organizing, and passive resistance. However, the Wall Street bombing blurred these distinctions. It erased the boundary between peaceful activism and violent extremism. The violent act of the bombing served as a stark reminder that the ideological commitment of anarchists could easily escalate into terrorism. Italian anarchists were seen with particular suspicion, and much of the investigation centered on them. Many of these individuals were recent immigrants facing economic hardship and exclusion. They lived in overcrowded tenements, working low-paying jobs in dangerous industries, and their grievances were shaped by direct experience with exploitation and repression. The harsh conditions they faced made anarchist ideology particularly attractive, offering both an explanation for their struggles and a radical solution: the violent destruction of the existing political and economic systems. Luigi Galliani, a radical anarchist leader, emerged as the figure most closely associated with this strain of thought. Galliani had been a vocal advocate for violent resistance against systemic oppression. His writings and speeches encouraged direct action and framed violence as a necessary tool to dismantle the capitalist system. Galliani's influence extended through informal networks rather than formal organizations, making it difficult for law enforcement to infiltrate or dismantle his followers' activities. Though Galliani had been deported to Italy in 1919, his followers remained active, operating in decentralized groups across the United States. These networks, though pressured by law enforcement, had not been fully eradicated. The 1919 series of bombings, which targeted prominent politicians, judges, and business leaders, had already linked Galliani's ideology to violent action. Although most of the bombs in that campaign failed to kill their intended targets, the attempt revealed a willingness among his followers to use explosives as political tools. The Wall Street bombing, with its deadly consequences and the sophistication of the attack, appeared to represent an escalation of these earlier efforts. Despite the raids, arrests, and deportations that followed the 1919 bombings, the radical networks continued to function. The decentralized nature of these groups made them hard to track, and the sheer number of anarchists and radicals in cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago meant that even with intensified surveillance, law enforcement had little hope of identifying every potential perpetrator. By 1920, the surveillance of anarchist movements was in full swing. Law enforcement officials kept close tabs on suspected radicals, with informants providing intelligence on meetings, publications, and even everyday activities. However, these efforts were hampered by the lack of coordination between agencies. The Bureau of Investigation, the U.S. Secret Service, and the New York Police Department all had different priorities and methods, leading to inefficiencies that only hindered the investigation into the bombing. The absence of a formal organization, clear leadership, or a centralized command structure meant that even accurate intelligence often failed to connect specific individuals to the bombing. The bombing's characteristics reinforced the belief that anarchism was to blame. The timed detonator, the choice of Wall Street as a target, and the lack of a suicide component all pointed to an individual or group motivated by political ideology rather than personal grievances. The perpetrators' desire to escape rather than martyr themselves suggested that the attack was not designed to raise the profile of a specific individual, but to strike a blow against the symbols of American capitalism and power. However, the very breadth of the anarchist movement made the investigation more complicated. Investigators had no clear target. Anarchism, as an ideology, was not limited to a small group of individuals, but instead spanned a wide range of people, many of whom had no involvement in violence. In this environment, any number of individuals sympathetic to anarchist ideals could have carried out the bombing without consulting others. The investigation's scope expanded to include hundreds of potential suspects, but few concrete leads emerged. Many individuals on the surveillance lists had no history of violence, and others with violent tendencies had been difficult to track. As the investigation focused more on ideological movements, it became less about finding a specific perpetrator and more about trying to understand the broader cultural and political climate that allowed such violence to occur. This shift in focus coincided with the public's growing anxiety over political extremism, especially in the wake of the Russian Revolution and the Red Scare. Media coverage of the bombing, along with reports of other anarchist attacks, fueled the perception that radical ideologies were a significant threat to national security. The investigation into the Wall Street bombing also faced significant legal and political challenges. The absence of definitive evidence, such as direct links between any individuals and the attack, made prosecution impossible. Authorities were forced to rely on circumstantial evidence, political beliefs, prior criminal activity, and vague associations to fuel their suspicion. But without concrete proof, they struggled to build a solid case. In public discussions, the bombing became a symbol of the threat posed by anarchism and radicalism. The media framed the attack as an act of ideological violence, and the public debate shifted from questions about the specific perpetrators to concerns about the larger political context. As the investigation continued, anarchism itself became the primary focus, and the bombing was understood not as an isolated incident, but as part of an ongoing struggle between radical ideologies and the established order. By the early 1920s, the investigation into the Wall Street bombing had entered a phase of gradual inertia. Officially, the case remained open, but the urgency of the initial response had faded, and the focus of law enforcement shifted toward other pressing matters. New priorities emerged, resources were redirected, and the bombing receded from the investigative spotlight. The case wasn't closed by a formal decision, but rather by the gradual accumulation of obstacles: lack of evidence, unreliable witnesses, legal limitations, and investigative exhaustion. The most significant barrier to progress remained the absence of preserved physical evidence. The rapid cleanup of the blast site had erased vital materials that could have anchored the investigation. The wagon and its components were destroyed, and the blast site was altered beyond reconstruction. Investigators were left with little more than photographs taken after the fact and vague written descriptions of the scene. Without physical evidence, the case became even more elusive. Forensic science at the time was inadequate for the task. There were no reliable methods for analyzing explosive residue, no sophisticated fingerprinting techniques, and no systems for tracing materials. The dynamite used in the attack was common for construction purposes, and the cast iron sash weights were ubiquitous. Attempts to trace these items led nowhere. Witness testimony, initially abundant, deteriorated over time, Memories, clouded by the shock and chaos of the moment, became increasingly unreliable. Descriptions of the wagon driver were inconsistent, with some recalling him as an average man in dark clothing, while others could not remember his appearance at all. The anonymity afforded by the lunch hour crowd on Wall Street meant no single account carried enough weight to narrow down potential suspects. Investigators tried to identify individuals with both the motive and the technical ability to carry out such an attack. But the overlapping characteristics of hundreds of potential suspects made this a daunting and fruitless task. Surveillance of anarchist communities continued, but it grew less effective. These networks had become more secretive in response to increased pressure, and the decentralized nature of anarchist movements meant that even with accurate intelligence, authorities struggled to connect any individual to the bombing. Legal constraints further hindered the investigation. While authorities could detain or deport individuals based on their political affiliations, they lacked the evidence needed to prosecute anyone for the bombing. As the months passed, the public's sense of urgency waned. Initial calls for swift action were replaced by a growing sense of resignation. Without further large-scale attacks, the bombing receded from public attention, and new issues rose to prominence. The investigation became a case study within law enforcement agencies. The Bureau of Investigation used the bombing as a reference point to advocate for expanded authority and centralized intelligence. But the lessons learned came too late to solve the case. By 1923, active investigative efforts had ceased. The case was not officially closed, but was no longer a priority. It had entered the category of unsolved crimes, its significance now tied to the questions it raised rather than its resolution. The bombing served as a reminder of vulnerabilities in public spaces and the challenges of confronting ideologically driven violence in a rapidly changing society. While the bombing left a lasting impact on Wall Street, both physically and psychologically, it did not dominate the national discourse. Its legacy was defined more by its unresolved nature than by any clarity on who was responsible. The unanswered questions about the bombing lingered, reshaping future investigations and policy decisions in ways that would continue to influence the U.S. For decades, the Wall Street bombing did not conclude with arrests, trials, or verdicts. Instead, it left a lasting legacy, shaping institutional change, altering assumptions, and prompting an evolution in the U.S. response to domestic threats. The absence of a named perpetrator allowed the bombing to function as a cautionary tale, rather than a closed chapter, influencing future violence prevention efforts in ways that were indirect but persistent. The bombing underscored the weaknesses within federal law enforcement. The Bureau of Investigation, still in its developmental stages, faced a crime that crossed political, social, and geographic boundaries. With limited resources and fragmented intelligence, the Bureau struggled to act decisively. The case became a key reference point in internal evaluations, highlighting the need for stronger federal investigative authority, improved information sharing systems, and a broader mandate to tackle political violence. This experience would eventually help shape the Bureau into a more centralized agency. The bombing also played a crucial role in the expansion of surveillance practices. Radical political organizations, anarchist groups, and labor activists were subjected to increasing scrutiny. Over time, the distinction between ideological dissent and operational threat became blurred. Investigators shifted their focus from individuals to entire movements, believing that if perpetrators could not be identified, then the movement itself should be monitored and controlled. Urban security thinking also evolved. The attack demonstrated that public spaces could be vulnerable to mass violence, challenging the previous assumption that only private buildings or government offices were at risk. While protective measures were not immediately implemented, awareness grew, particularly within financial districts. Discussions about security for public spaces began, though Wall Street did not become heavily fortified. The district's openness remained largely intact, but the attack marked the beginning of a shift toward acknowledging vulnerabilities in urban spaces. Public psychology also shifted in the wake of the bombing. The attack validated existing fears about instability, radicalism, and the possibility of violence in everyday settings. These fears reinforced public support for restrictive policies and aggressive enforcement actions. The expectation of increased surveillance and control became normalized as necessary components of safety. However, the unresolved nature of the bombing created an abstract and lingering fear. The enemy was undefined, and fear persisted in the absence of closure. Historically, the Wall Street bombing occupies a unique position. It was one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in the US. Before World War II, yet it lacked the narrative closure typically provided by a trial or confession. The event was remembered for its destruction, casualties, and lasting consequences, but without personal accountability. The scars left on the Morgan Building's facade served as silent reminders, visible for decades after the attack, marking the spot where violence had struck. For historians, the bombing represented both an opportunity and a frustration. It provided insight into early 20th century political violence, law enforcement practices, and the vulnerabilities of urban spaces. Yet, the absence of definitive evidence prevented concrete conclusions. Italian anarchists were widely suspected, but this assumption was based on ideological alignment rather than direct proof. The bombing's unresolved nature made it a case study often referenced in discussions of terrorism, but the mystery of who was responsible remained unsolved. The bombing's unresolved legacy influenced later acts of terrorism. Analysts and journalists occasionally referenced it as a precedent for ideologically driven violence. While the methods and scale evolved, the underlying challenge of anonymous, ideologically motivated violence persisted. The bombing's impact was felt in legal discussions about prosecuting crimes driven by ideology rather than personal grievance. It contributed to the development of laws addressing conspiracy, material support, and interstate criminal activity. The bombing's unresolved nature also influenced the discourse around civil liberties. The aggressive responses it triggered were later reassessed, particularly as the excesses of the Red Scare became more apparent. The Wall Street bombing was cited as an example of how fear had expanded state power at the expense of individual rights. This legacy influenced how future threats were addressed, and how fear could lead to overreach. For the families of the victims, the lack of justice meant that memory became the primary means of reckoning. The absence of closure prolonged their grief, and without arrests or convictions, the trauma remained unresolved. Survivors of the bombing, many of whom lived with permanent disabilities, navigated a world that had returned to normalcy while their lives remained altered by the violence. Compensation for the victims was inconsistent and inadequate, reflecting the limited frameworks of support available in the early 20th century. The bombing's legacy continued through both private and public memory. It became part of institutional learning, referenced in law enforcement training materials and internal discussions on how to respond to radical violence. It also influenced academic studies on political violence, urban security, and the limits of investigative methods available at the time. In popular memory, the Wall Street bombing remained a reference rather than a well-known historical event. It did not occupy the same narrative space as other major attacks that prompted significant national action. Instead, it faded into history as a largely forgotten tragedy, its victims remembered privately, and its anniversary passed quietly. However, its unresolved nature ensured that it remained an open question, shaping future approaches to violence and security without providing any concrete answers. The unresolved status of the bombing became integral to its meaning. It was not the resolution that defined it, but the persistence of questions left unanswered. The bombing remained significant not because it was solved, but because it was not. Its legacy endures in the lessons it spurred, about the vulnerability of public spaces, the difficulties of combating ideologically motivated violence, and the ways societies must adapt to new threats without complete understanding. The absence of closure did not diminish the bombing's impact. Instead, it ensured that its memory would continue to influence policy, law enforcement, and public perception of terrorism for years to come. It highlighted the challenges of confronting violence in an open society, and ensured that its legacy remained unresolved, shaped by fear, speculation, and unanswered questions. Long after the investigation faded and public attention shifted, Wall Street continued to carry evidence of the bombing. Visible reminders of the attack were not memorials, but damage left unrepaired. Iron fragments from the explosion remained embedded in building facades, particularly on the Morgan Building, where shrapnel scars marked the paths of destruction. These marks were not symbolic, but residual, preserved by the force of the blast. For those working in the district, the scars became part of the daily environment. Some knew their origin, but most did not. Over time, they faded from view, becoming unnoticed features of the cityscape, recalled only during anniversaries. Without official recognition, their story was passed along through memory and word of mouth. Despite the bombing, the financial district quickly returned to normal operations. Transactions continued, buildings filled, and the daily rhythms of commerce reasserted themselves. The openness of Wall Street remained largely intact, with no permanent security measures introduced. The assumption that the bombing was an isolated event led to the decision not to tighten security. The bombing became part of institutional learning within law enforcement. It was cited in training materials as an early example of mass casualty violence linked to ideological movements. The case highlighted failures in evidence preservation and coordination, leading to gradual reforms in the Bureau of Investigation, which eventually grew into a more centralized agency with expanded jurisdiction. Academically, the bombing became a case study in political violence and early domestic terrorism. Historians analyzed it through the lens of the Red Scare and growing fears of radicalism. While Italian anarchists were often blamed based on ideological alignment, no definitive evidence was ever found. The bombing's place in American history was relatively limited compared to later attacks that led to major legislative changes. Its victims were not widely commemorated, and its anniversary passed quietly. Its significance remained in its unresolved nature. For the families of the victims, the absence of closure meant grief was prolonged. Without trials or convictions, memory became the means of reckoning. The bombing became a defining moment in their personal histories rather than in national mythology. The injured carried their own reminders, living with permanent disabilities or scars. Some received compensation, though it was inconsistent, reflecting the limited support systems of the time. These individuals navigated a world that had returned to normalcy, while their lives remained altered. The bombing influenced the interpretation of later acts of terrorism. Analysts referenced it as a precedent for ideologically driven violence, with the challenge of anonymous attacks remaining consistent. Urban security practices gradually shifted, and the idea that public spaces could be targeted without warning became part of planning discussions. Though concrete measures were not immediately implemented, awareness of vulnerability in public areas increased. The bombing's legacy endured through institutional memory rather than memorials. The scars on Wall Street remained as silent reminders of the attack, ignored by many but noticeable to those who recognized them. Over time, they became woven into the fabric of the district, a lasting impact of the event without direct acknowledgement. As the 20th century progressed, advancements in forensic science and investigative tools transformed law enforcement. Yet, the Wall Street bombing remained an artifact of an earlier era, defined by the investigative constraints of the time. The unresolved nature of the case ensured its relevance as a reference point, raising questions about how to address ideologically motivated violence within ordinary systems. The legacy of the bombing was shaped by its lack of resolution. It remained open to interpretation, serving as a reminder that some acts of violence do not provide clear answers, but continue to shape societies through their unresolved effects. The bombing's influence persisted not through its resolution, but through the lasting changes it spurred in institutional practices, public perceptions, and the understanding of vulnerability in modern cities. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.